Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to Brookwood Church, and on behalf of Bill Hoy and McAfee, we are privileged to have you here. I've often said that it's during those times of the deepest grief that people are going through that we can have the deepest impact. Jesus was described by Isaiah many, many years in advance of his coming to the earth, that he would be a man of sorrow, acquainted with grief. And whoever offers, later on, it says, whoever offers a cup of cold water in my name will by no means lose his reward. So we are really happy that you are here. I'm going to pray for our time. It's super important what we're doing here today, but we need God's help to help us to absorb all of this information so that we can be the greatest help that we can be for the people that we're serving. So let's pray. Lord God, thank you for the opportunity to serve the people that you have assigned to us. We know that it's like walking on holy ground to be invited into another person's grief. So Lord, help us. Quicken our minds, help us to pay attention and to absorb all of the things that you have for us today for the good of those that we serve. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, Doug. Appreciate it. Well, thank you, Doug, and a big thank you to everyone at Brookwood who's made this a possibility. We appreciate the support of everyone who's been involved. Kristen and her team have really been incredible. Kristen and her team at Brookwood have really been incredible throughout this whole process, and it's a big undertaking for us, and so we just really appreciate their support. To all of you who decided to come out today, I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank you for making this a priority, for making this topic a priority. It's something that's really important to us at Thomas McAfee, and we're glad that all of you have decided to spend some time with us today learning about what we feel is a very important subject. To our sponsors, thank you for making this possible. Thank you for your support. So many of you have been longtime sponsors of this event and longtime supporters of the event, and that's very much appreciated. Finally, to Brenda Atkinson. Brenda is our continuing care coordinator and grief counselor at Thomas McAfee, and she runs our community education program. And so she's responsible for the coordination of this event. And Brenda, we can't thank you enough for all the work you put into making this event possible every year. This is our 20th annual grief seminar. So 20 years ago, my dad, John, and my uncle Tommy had this idea for grief education in the community, and they wanted to facilitate that through this idea of a grief seminar. And we feel so fortunate that 20 years later, we can continue to have this event and continue to act out the vision they had 20 years ago. In our industry, we are fortunate to have access to so many grief resources and access to grief experts like Dr. Hoy, but we feel very strongly, we believe very strongly in this idea that if we're going to facilitate healthy grief experiences for families, then we have to deliberately focus on not just educating ourselves at Thomas McAfee, not just educating ourselves in the industry, but on educating the public, on educating those who are grieving, on educating those who will grieve at some point, and on educating those who will interact with grievers. And I think, this is the professional session. I think so many of you in the audience, whether you're virtual or in person, fall into that last category in a way that's very intimate. And so, again, we very much appreciate you being here. And for that reason, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Hoy here. I can say Dr. Hoy has been a resource for our firm. We've leaned on his expertise for many years now. And I can say personally that Dr. Hoy has played a big role in my perspective on grief and developing my perspective and in developing my perspective on the role we play in funeral service and helping families grieve. So, Dr. Hoy, we're glad to have you here. For anyone who's not familiar with Dr. Hoy's work, I'll give a brief introduction. For more than 30 years, William G. Hoy has walked alongside the dying and bereaved, as well as provided continuing education to colleagues in healthcare and human service professions. He holds a full-time teaching and research post as clinical professor of medical humanities at Baylor University, where he has taught since 2012. Prior to his move to Baylor, Dr. Hoy directed the clinical counseling program for a large Southern California hospice and community bereavement center. In addition to his graduate education in counseling, Bill holds the Fellow in Thanatology, the highest professional certification for advanced practice professionals in the field of death, dying, and bereavement. He is author of more than 125 articles and a half dozen books, the latest of which is Bereavement Groups and the Role of Social Support, integrating theory, research, and practice. Bill and Debbie Hoy are parents to 2 adult children, and they make their home in rural central Texas, about 25 miles from the Baylor campus. It's my privilege to introduce Dr. Bill Hoy. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you, Jay. Thanks. Tom, are you in here also? Well, so in case you didn't get this piece, Jay McAfee and his cousin Tom are the 5th generation of this family to run this business. So that's a pretty incredible legacy. I don't know what that says about funerals, except when you get that many kids that kind of keep following along. How many of you are the 5th generation in your profession? Yeah, that's what I thought. That's a pretty amazing legacy of the way this family has taken care of this community. And I'm pretty picky. I'm pretty selective actually in who I will work with, to be completely candid. And I guess probably 15 years ago, John, does that seem right, when you and I may have met at a selected meeting? I kind of think it may have been 2000. So that's 22 years ago. We first met and struck up a friendship, and we began talking about ways that I might be supportive of their staff. I was still, of course, in practice in Southern California at the time, and I've just been amazed by the compassion and the care. Made it through the day yesterday without crying about this, but my brother died a week ago yesterday, and in fact I'm leaving here this afternoon to go to Baton Rouge for his funeral. And one day last week, when I had gotten to Baton Rouge, Brenda called me and said, when is the funeral? And I told her, and I don't remember exactly the way this scenario unfolded, so I'm going to tell it to you the way I think it unfolded. And at some point later, she asked for my date of birth. It's a weird question. And then she informed me that the McAfees had arranged to get me home this afternoon. My flight would have taken me back to Dallas, and then I would have had to try to get from Dallas back to Baton Rouge, and they booked it, scheduled it, paid for it, and got it taken care of so that I will be in Baton Rouge at 5:45 this afternoon for my brother's visitation. That's the kind of folks they are. So John, thank you, and Tommy, if you're still in here, Jay, Tom, thank you for the amazing way that you take care of us, and Brenda, for your friendship over the years. Thank you. Spiritual care in an uncertain world. How do we make sense of the senseless? I will call her Pam. Pam called me in May after the pandemic began roaring through the United States in March. Pam is a therapist in the northeastern part of the United States, and she said, I just need to talk to somebody who gets it. And all of us have probably had that story at one point or another in our lives. She said, I just need to talk to somebody who gets it. And I said, well, what's going on? She said, well, I heard you speak at, and she named the conference that I had been present at a few years back. She said, my mom died the third week of March, the first week after the lockdown began in my community. And the community she lived in, you're probably already figuring out what community it might have been, locked down faster than anybody and stayed locked down longer than anybody. And she said, my mom died the third week of March, and for the last 12 days of her life in the skilled nursing facility where she was, I was unable to go in and see her. And my mom had significant hearing and sight impairment, which even though we tried to do FaceTime, was simply not possible. And I said, what do you suppose, Pam, I'll call her now, that's not her name, but what do you suppose, Pam, is the hardest part of this experience for you so far? And she said, Bill, I think what the hardest part for me so far is that I promised my dad 7 years ago when he was dying that I would take care of my mom until she died, and I have now broken that promise. The one thing that I told my dad I would do, I have been unable to fulfill. Now, I know that there are a lot of well-meaning friends who would undoubtedly tell Pam, they probably did, in fact, you have nothing to feel guilty about. You have nothing to be ashamed of. You did take care of your mom. You did the best you could, and all of the other things that we are prone to tell people when they offer those kinds of concerns to us. And what I can tell you just as strongly is that none of those things made any difference to her. She felt the deep wound of having made a promise that in her way she did not feel like she had fulfilled. And as we talked, what I realized is that for her, the promise that she made was a matter of spiritual truth. I have come to the conclusion now in my 37th year of taking care of the dying and bereaved that what we bring to our care of the dying and bereaved has something to do with our training and our skill, but it has a whole lot to do with who we are, our character, the virtue that makes us up. Interestingly enough, it's the same message that I deliver to my medical students at Baylor, is that, yes, I want you to be the very finest physician with the very highest level of expertise you can find, and I want to help you become the woman or man who is going to make a great physician. And so it is for all of us, because that really is spiritual work. Now, you may have come today expecting any number of things about what spirituality might mean or how I might define it. it's probably fair if I disclose at least a few of my biases up front. One of those biases is that I come to the world of spirituality as an unapologetic, biblical, evangelical Christian. And everything I say about spirituality is somewhat filtered through that lens. You have to understand that about me. You might have to overlook that at times, but you have to hear that because I can't speak about that which I do not know, and that is what I know. At the same time, I think the way we define spirituality in our culture is different than that. And I'm going to take great pains this morning to differentiate the way some of us, whether that's our religious heritage or something else is, how some of us define the word spiritual from the way it is frequently defined in healthcare these days. And you should also probably know I'm going to define some ways I think that the way we define it in healthcare becomes problematic, especially for people who belong to my brand of Christianity. And we're going to talk about that because if you're not from my brand, you need to understand how my brand thinks, because there are a lot of my brand in South Carolina. All right? So you need to understand us if you're going to seek to take care of us in any significant way, if that's not your heritage. So let me kind of lay out for you where I see us going in the time that we are together today. The CEU police tell us that we have to define objectives and make all of that clear. So the objectives are coming up on the screen. And let me just kind of lay out for you what I see us doing. So one of the things that I hope that in our conversation, and as best we can, I want to make this a conversation. I mean, yeah, I'm standing 8 feet above you and all of that, but I still want this to be a conversation. I want to make sure that we really do define these key components, if you will, of spiritual care and what we mean by all of that. I want to make sure that we outline the role of spiritual care professionals. How many of you work in hospice settings? Okay, about maybe a third. Okay, how about hospital settings, acute care, skilled nursing, education? Let's see, congregational care. You're a church minister or volunteer. You haven't gotten to raise your hand, but you'd really like to. Private practice therapists, any private practice people, licensed LPCs, marriage family therapists. Okay, who else hasn't gotten to raise your hand? I need to know who you are so I know who I'm talking to. Just yell out what your role, job title, what you do that brought you today. Okay. Child and family social work, okay. Anybody else? Say it again. Home care, all right. Funeral home. Yeah, there are a few of those.
I'm a volunteer in grief support.
Grief support volunteer, yeah. Okay, great. All right, well, I want to make sure that the reason I wanted to take a moment to do that was because I will talk about the spiritual care professionals who work in many of these settings, because what I have found is that folks in nursing and social work and medicine and some of the other disciplines, for example, in hospice, often don't understand what exactly it is that the pastoral care, spiritual care, or chaplain staff do. They sure like having them around, especially when death is in the offing, but they're not always sure what exactly they do. And then finally, I want to make sure that that kind of through the morning, and I'm not doing these sequentially. All of these are sort of wound into what I plan for us to do together today. I want to make sure that we talk about cultural appropriateness and how do we make sure that we are meeting people sort of where they are. I teach in a field called medical humanities, and that might be a strange term to some of you. The way we say it is that we are turning physicians into humans before medical school turns them into gods. Any doctors here? Oh, okay. But essentially what we are trying to do is to help young physicians understand the role of the patient-professional relationship, and also the experiential piece of the patient's lived experience with illness. So it's a very patient-focused approach, which of course works nicely when you've taken care of folks on the behavioral health side of the aisle all of your career. And as a result of that, one of the things that I've discovered over the years is that when we're coming alongside people with this kind of patient-focused, patient-centered care, what happens is we begin asking a lot more questions and making a lot fewer statements. We start asking them to tell us their story so that we in turn can meet their needs in ways that are appropriate, that are in line with their values and their own intentions in life and some of those kinds of things. So anyway, that's where I see us going together today. What I'm going to lay out for you between now and noon, including the break in the middle of the morning, are 8 strategies that I think will help us to help our patients, our clients, our congregants, whatever the right term is for the place that you work and care for people, 8 strategies that will help us care for them effectively. Here's the first one. I think if we're going to start doing this, we have to start by making sure we confirm the value of attending to spiritual issues. Let me say a word about why I think that is so essential. I'm going to talk about definitions in a moment, but one of the things I have discovered over my career is that especially when it comes to end-of-life and bereavement things, those issues are intrinsically wound up with the transcendent part of us, the part of us that is beyond the me that is here and now. I would imagine that one could do some levels of marriage and family therapy and stay away from spiritual issues unless your client brings it up. I could imagine you might be able to pull that off. I could imagine you could be a school counselor dealing with educational psychology issues, dealing with academic excellence issues, and stay pretty far away from spiritual issues. I am convinced it is nigh on impossible to deal with people at end of life and in bereavement and ignore the spiritual dimension of who we are. And part of the reason for that, I believe, is that death is an unusual loss in this one way. With death, I am always confronted as the bereaved person as well as the dying person with, is there anything next? And if so, what is it? And that doesn't happen so much when you are an educational psychologist, for example. When we are dealing with death, we are dealing with ultimate kinds of issues, with ultimate reality, with very transcendent kinds of issues. And because of that, I think we absolutely must ask our patients and clients, in whatever way is appropriate for them and cognizant with our own background, what about the focus of your life? What are you thinking about what comes next? How are you making sense of this experience and what that means? Because all of that is part of this dilemma to make spiritual meaning in loss. The 5 kind of core issues that I think sort of percolate to the top are the ones that I've listed up on the screen and I think in your outline, though I don't remember now. And they're the 5 issues of the beliefs and practices. Now, that sounds like the typical description or definition of religion. It's sort of belief and practice oriented, the rituals, the prayers, the ceremonies, the whatever. Okay, fair enough. But what I find is that people who say, I'm not very religious, usually have all kinds of beliefs and practices. In fact, sometimes they have beliefs and practices about spiritual things that are bigger than some of the most, quote, religious people I know. They're very insistent kind of on how they make meaning, for example, of the death. And they want particular things said or particular music sung because it carries some kind of transcendent meaning for them. So the person who says, I'm not very religious, may still have these very significant beliefs and practices. Well, guess what? The only way I know is if I inquire. Right? I can't find that out. I've also discovered that making assumptions about that gets me into trouble most of the time. I used to think if people came to the same church that I attended, that they probably saw life the same way I did. And that only took me about 3 weeks to figure out that's not true, right? And then the last 35 or 40 years trying to figure out what is true if that's not. Because what I've discovered is that we live, that just because people gather in a particular community, they may or may not share a whole lot of things about what happens next. I've been astounded as I've talked to folks. One of the best illustrations that I can ever remember of this, when I was taking care of hospice patients probably 35 years ago, this story would have been, I went out to see a woman who was dying. And the face sheet that had come from the nurse was that she was a member of this leading evangelical congregation in our community. I knew the pastor, I knew the church, I knew their theology. They were not part of my denomination, but I knew them very well. And I began talking with this woman, and I asked her, as I frequently do ask dying people, this simple question. So of all the things that must really scare the EBGBs out of you right now, what do you suppose frightens you the most? And this was her response. I wonder if I have done enough good to get me into heaven. Now, I'm an evangelical Christian, and evangelical Christians, at least officially, believe it has absolutely nothing to do with what I do, good, bad, or indifferent. And I was a little bit set back by that because I knew the church. She was actually a leader of the congregation that she had identified with. And what I realized fairly quickly was that her theology practiced in the pew and the theology taught from the pulpit were about 1,000 miles apart. And interestingly enough, I encouraged her. In fact, I actually asked her, could I call your pastor and have him stop by and sort of sort through some of those issues with you? Because I knew what the guy would do. And she said, yeah, I think that'd be really good if you'd do that. And so I did. I phoned him and asked him if he'd stop by, and he did. I think he was there twice over the next 2 or 3 weeks. I went to her funeral because she had really gotten close to our team had gotten close to her, and our whole team went. I went in support of them. And the same pastor, the one I had referred her to, who I knew had visited with her a couple of times, in the funeral service said, and so what you need to know about, called her name, was that from the day she confessed Christ 15 years ago until the day she died, there was never one moment of doubt, not one shadow of turning, he said, in where she would spend eternity. And I thought, well, you didn't talk to the same patient I talked to then. Because there absolutely was. And I think probably what happened for this very good pastor was that he heard his own theology, but he did not hear her struggle. And sometimes that's the echo chamber in which we live, is we hear our own background, but we don't necessarily hear what our patient, our congregant, or our client is saying. By the way, the same thing, well, never mind, I won't say that about politics, but echo chambers go all over, right? So, okay. All right, so beliefs and practices, my core values. In your notes, write down what you think are the most important 3 or 4 attributes, character qualities, virtues that a person ought to possess if she or he is going to support a bereaved person? What do you hope is in your heart? What kinds of character do you want to describe you? In other words, if I had to create your epitaph, what would you like it to say? Just write down 3 or 4 words. Somebody got the mics? All right, I guess we'll shout them out. All right, let's hear a few of them. Just shout them loudly, because I won't hear if you don't shout loudly. Compassion. Say it again. Faithful. Love. Over here again. Integrity. Kindness. Non-judgmental. Courageous. Truthful. Trustworthy. Genuine. Present. All right, well, the list could go on for a while, I bet. These are core values. I'm guessing that the ones you wrote down are the ones you most prize in your own life and practice. I don't know if you noticed or not, but most of these grow out of some deep place of who we are. Most of these, I don't know about you, but I did not arrive on the planet knowing the importance of being honest. When I was a little boy, I lied like a rug. And by the way, I've not met many little boys who didn't. Most of us lie like crazy. If you've got toddler or preschool boys, moms, you probably have seen it, lived it, heard it, witnessed it, and been part of it. Integrity is not something we arrive knowing. The care for other people, empathy or compassion. I don't know about you, but I didn't get here knowing how to do that. Some of that I learned. Some of that came from a deep place of resonance, of realizing what's important. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a deeply spiritual issue. And I don't happen to think it is any accident that all of the scriptures in all of the faith communities of the world talk about character. And they talk about it a lot. Of course, I probably know the Christian scriptures better than most of the other scriptures, but what I absolutely know is that hardly a page goes by that doesn't talk about who we are. A whole lot more, by the way, than it talks about what we do, which is one of the reasons that we are called human beings instead of human doings. It's because what we bring to the bereavement field and what we bring to people who are hurting is not so much what we know, though that's very important, and I don't want incompetence anywhere, but what we really bring is much more than that, because we bring who we are. Core values. We also grapple in spiritual care with life's purpose and its meaning. How many of us have sat with bereaved people who in deep tears and deep frustration say, I don't know what my life matters anymore now that he died. I don't know, I have nothing left to live for. Most of us have dealt with older adults who say, there's probably nobody left to come to my funeral. I've gone to all of theirs. I have no friends left. I've outlived everybody in my family, everybody in my friendship circle. There really is no one left. I don't know what purpose I have. How many times in the years that I've taken care of older adults, and I took care of a lot of older adults, especially in the clinical years, who would say, you know, I don't even know why God's left me here this long. I can't walk, I can't drive, I can't do anything anymore. You know, I'm just kind of here. Some of them would say, I'm just laying here in this bed. I have no purpose. That is a deeply spiritual question that I think we have an obligation to lead people as they grapple with that, but more than grapple with it, to help them find some resolution to that, because I think our purpose matters till the moment we die. I think we have something to contribute to the world. I am of the very strange, I realize, very strange belief that folks that have significant dementia, who cannot communicate, who are nonverbal, if they contribute nothing else, they absolutely contribute this. They contribute the awareness to the people who care for them, be they family or hired professionals. You are not the center of the universe. And I think that's a pretty amazing gift for me to receive when I care for another person. The second, I'm not sure where my slide went, but if I could go back to the one just before this. The fourth piece is the relationship beyond myself. My sense of transcendence is the word we use a lot. I'm not the most important person. I know that's hard to believe when we spend most of our time on Facebook and Instagram, and I kept calling it TokTik last night, but I think it's TikTok, right? But you get the point, right? When most of my time is online, I may really think that a very large part of my existence consists of creating the image of how I will appear to other people. So I talk a lot about where I've been and what I've done and the cool places I've gone and the new purse I've bought. I've bought so many purses in my life, or whatever, you know. I mean, making sure that everybody knows that. And if I have nothing else to communicate, then I figure that you might be really interested in knowing what I had for breakfast today. I've been astounded. I've noticed this in the last 10 years especially. I eat in restaurants a lot when I travel, of course. I've been astounded at the number of people who take pictures of their food. I'm assuming it is to post to social media. I don't know about you, but I really don't care what you're having for dinner tonight. All right? Don't waste my time with that. Okay. But you see, that's what I mean. We have become a society that is very self-focused. And I think what spiritual care does for us is it reminds me, believe it or not, the sun does not rotate around my life. This is not an anthrocentric universe, a Bill-centric universe. And I think that that's what transcendence does for us. And then I think a fifth thing that spiritual care reminds us to look after is the common community that we share. It's interesting, you know, I made light of this a while ago, that often people who worship in the same place or share the same label or those kinds of things often don't share the same values, the same perspectives, and some of those kinds of things. You know, I'm a Baptist, and for good or for bad, but one of the things I realized quite a number of years ago is that, you know, you can make a list of Baptists over the last 50 years, and you will be hard-pressed to figure out where we stand politically, because they include people like Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton. They include people like Billy Graham and his son Franklin. They include people like Martin Luther King, Al Sharpton. Figuring out where we all stand politically is a crapshoot at best. And I think that's pretty amazing, but that reminds me that there are some things in spiritual life that probably do suggest that the old adage that birds of a feather flock together really is true. It's been interesting to me over the years that while it's certainly true that when I get with other people who are part of my spiritual community, there may be bits and pieces of our belief system that get crosswise with one another, but we are all motivated by the same group of basic ideas, the same group of basic strategies, and in fact, the same group of basic theological pronouncements. And I think that's really true in spiritual community. Now, what I've got to always be careful of is that I not allow my stereotype of a spiritual community to somehow become my definition of what that means to you. And let me illustrate. Some of you heard me tell this story of when I acted in a really stupidly way one time. I've done it enough times. I've got lots of those stories. Here's just one. So I was taking care of hospice patients in Southern California, and I was out to see this man and his wife, and I'm going to call him Salvatore, and that's probably not exactly what his name was, but it's pretty close. Salvatore and his wife, who I'll call Rosemary, had immigrated from New York to Southern California, but before they immigrated from New York, they immigrated from Florence, Italy. And so they spoke with a wonderful Italian accent, and let me tell you folks, they were Catholic. I mean, we're talking Catholic with a great big capital C, all right? In fact, when they moved to Southern California, they were already in their late 70s at that point. Now, they were both in their 90s by now, but they were in their late 70s, and they were forward-thinking enough that they bought a home directly across from Holy Family Catholic Church because they realized as they became less able to drive, they needed to be able to walk to daily Mass. All right, that's how forwardly, and that's how Catholic they were, all right? Well, so it's the early 1990s, and I'm a very adept hospice chaplain who has learned everything about every religious community, of course. And so I go to see them. And sometime during our conversation, I said to them, because I knew that the church had long since, after Vatican II, had largely depreciated the role of what used to be called last rites or extreme unction, and that instead the church much preferred for a priest to come and bring what was called the sacrament of the anointing of the sick. Well, I knew that from a theoretical perspective because I'd learned that somewhere along the way. So I say to Salvatore, I know Father Brian over at Holy Family, and I bet he would be delighted to come over and bring the sacrament of the anointing. And that's all the further I got before Salvatore put his arms up like this and said, "No!" And I thought, I don't know what I just stepped in, but I stepped in something, right? And I tried to recover from that and make less of a fool of myself than I already did. And I tried to understand, and I couldn't get there. And I immediately, when I left there, went to see my friend, Father Brian Coughlin, across the street. He was sitting in his office directory. And I knocked on the door, and he invited me in. We chatted, and I said, I was just over to see Salvatore and Rosemary. He said, "You were great parishioners of mine." And I told him the story, and he leaned back in his chair and let out the biggest Irish belly laugh that I had ever heard. And he said, "Oh, Bill, what you've got to know about Salvatore and Rosemary is they're pre-Vatican II Christians, Catholics. They don't buy all that, and when you said Father Brian could come, that was all they heard. Because what they know is that when the priest shows up, the undertaker is right behind him." You see, it is really important that I not assume that the labels that you use about your spiritual life are defined the same way that I define the same labels. And that leads me to this important caveat. And it's a caveat that I offer from those of us who have hung around maybe Protestant or evangelical circles, and certainly some others over the years. It is the caveat to understand, if I could have the next slide, it is the caveat to understand that our understanding of spiritual as healthcare professionals and the understanding of spiritual that is offered up by lots of people who would call themselves Orthodox or biblical Christians is not the same. You see, when healthcare professionals think the word spiritual, we're thinking really big tent. Healthcare professionals use the word spiritual to encompass all kinds of stuff, including the things that I just talked about a few minutes ago. But people who come from a strong biblical background often don't define spiritual that way because, the New Testament does not define spiritual that way. The New Testament has a very narrow definition of what the word spiritual means. When the New Testament, especially the Apostle Paul, uses the word spiritual, he's talking about being separated, being holy, being one who walks with God, being one whose life beats with the mind of Christ. He is not talking at all about this big tent, whatever in the world you want spiritual to mean. And so it is really important, if you define spirituality in a big tent kind of way, that you remember that people who don't define spirituality that way, when you ask, are you spiritual? They may very well say, no, I'd like to be. I'd hope to be, but I don't think I get anywhere close. I'm not anywhere there. You know, and this happened in a conversation that I was part of with an intern that I was supervising, and he had been through clinical pastoral education, and he had learned about the importance of using my word big tent definitions to describe spirituality. And he was talking with an older adult who had been active in an evangelical free church. You may actually know the church. It was the one pastored for many years in Fullerton, California by Dr. Chuck Swindoll. She knew what the word spiritual meant in her congregation, in her small group, and in her life. And it was not what my young CPE-educated intern thought it meant. So he asked her, so Marge, are you spiritual? And she said, oh, no. I've longed to be. I want to be. I'm covered by the grace of God, but I'm not very spiritual. And my poor little intern didn't know what to do with that. He just couldn't make sense out of that change in terminology. And I helped him. I said, well, Marge, I bet we've got a difference in terminology going here. Would you tell Mark a little bit about how you see the word spiritual? How do you hear that? And we had a most amazing conversation over about the next 35 minutes or so as she told her story. Okay, you ready for the kicker? So we're walking out the door, going down the sidewalk to the car. Mark, who's probably 25, turns to me and he said, you know, Bill, I believe she may be the most spiritual woman I've ever met. It's very important that we understand what people mean when they use the terminology that we may not always mean. There are some other subpoints there. If you guys would just scan on through, I'm not sure how the PowerPoint's going to go, but we think of it in our professional code as it means purpose and meaning, values, but not necessarily related to any particular religious. We think in professional codes when we use the word spiritual that it means it's personally defined. In fact, I hear that a lot in healthcare these days, that the difference between spiritual and personal and spiritual and religious is that religious is communal and spiritual is very personal. That is true in the way that we use that term in healthcare circles. That's just not a word that makes sense to people who have spent many years listening to folks like St. Paul. And then the other column will come up here, and I'll show you sort of how many, I won't by any means stereotype to say all, but many Orthodox, or what they may call themselves to be biblically based Christians might say, is that what that spiritual means is that I'm not carnal, I'm not worldly, I'm seeking to walk with God rather than to do stuff for myself. I'm committed to a lifestyle of knowing and following Christ. That's what it means to be spiritual if you're listening to the way the word is used. Universally, by the way, in the New Testament. It's been a long time since I studied Greek, but I'll go to the mat on that one, that's the only way you can interpret that. When you read the words of St. Paul, and that it likely is a measure of mature faith. And so you can understand why if you ask some old sainted believer, are you spiritual, they might answer by saying, well, no, I'd like to be, but no, I'm not anywhere close to that. All right, well, I think I've probably spent enough time there. The last thing I was going to show you on the next slide is actually just a word of how, because I've quoted from him a few times, how the Apostle Paul dealt with that in 1 Corinthians, and you can kind of see where this theological or spiritual construct comes from. He says, I could not address you as spiritual, but as worldly, mere infants in Christ. I gave you milk, not solid food, for you were not yet ready for it. Indeed, you are still not ready. You're still worldly. For since there is jealousy and quarreling among you, are you not worldly? Are you not acting like mere men? And so where I'm going with this simply is how important it is for us to understand terminology and what our patients, clients, congregants even are thinking when we use particular terms, that there is not an agreed denotative meaning to some words in our culture. All right. So let me see here. I believe let's just skip the next slide. Let me talk a little bit about this second principle, and that's to acknowledge the spiritual challenges of a changeable world. The last time I was here, the world was normal. When I flew from Greenville, South Carolina, back to my home in Dallas last March, I literally felt the world closing behind me. I don't know if I've ever told you this, Brenda, but I was so unconfident when I left Greenville that Friday afternoon. I believe it was March the 10th last year. I'd been here and had done a spring conference for the McAfees over at one of their chapels. I was so unconfident, if that's a word, that the world might shut down and that airplanes might not fly, that while I was sitting on the tarmac at Greenville Airport, I went on my Avis app and rented a car one way from Atlanta to get me to Dallas, because I really was not sure when I left Greenville. There was a lot of talk that they might shut the airlines down. We were in that period. And I released the rental on that car, as the airplane, I broke all the rules, by the way, because I left my phone on even, after we taxied out from the gate. And I released the rental on that car as I felt the landing gear go up on the airplane in Atlanta, because I thought they won't divert us anywhere else. We'll go to Dallas from here. And that's the lack of confidence I had. We began that day to witness the world change around us. And the kinds of things that we have done, the changes that we have adapted to, the things that, look around this room. There are probably at least 20 people in this room who are wearing a mask that would have 2 years ago. We are spread out far more. That's part of the reason that we came to this venue. If you had ever been to a McAfee seminar before, we were all bunched in together, kind of shoulder to shoulder. And we did lots of group work, none of which I'm planning to do today because I really don't want to make you get that close to one another. They set up only 4 chairs at these tables that 2 years ago would have easily accommodated 8. Might have even crammed in 10. All of those things are very different, and that's just the tip of the iceberg for the way the world has changed around us. Those are very minor things. Who would ever have thought 2 years ago, who would ever have thought that you would not be able to stand at the bedside of a dying family member? Who would ever have imagined that families would stand on the sidewalk in front of the hospital while their loved one died in the ICU? Who would have ever imagined that? Who would ever have thought that in communities that have long prized the whole community gathering for a funeral, that would be limited to the funeral director, the clergy person, and 1 or 2 family members? And that was practiced all over Europe last year and in some communities here in the United States. Who would ever have thought that the people who actually went to church would do so on a computer screen? And that, I'm assuming in this congregation, a pastor broadcast a message from an office or from here with nobody in the room or something, I guess, didn't you? Yeah. Who would have ever thought? Our world is changeable. And we have in our generation seen that up close in full living color. And I think what we want to do with spiritual care in the midst of that, and by the way, this is true for all of us, whether we wear a spiritual care hat or we don't, is we want to identify what the potential spiritual challenges are. Here's the question that I ask. I've asked this question hundreds of times. I ask it to my students all the time. I ask it everywhere I go. What are you making of this? What are you making of this? That's a code for how are you making sense of this. And what that elicits are these amazing conversations most of the time about, isn't this something? Who would have ever thought this? Who would have ever thought this was the way things would be? Who would have ever imagined this? What are you making of this? I think it is really important that we ask people the question that I started learning to ask of hospice patients a long time ago. And I ask this of everybody, whether they are sick or not now. What are the big things that frighten you? What are the things that worry you right now? I am convinced, my colleagues who see a whole lot more patients than I do, I have a colleague who teaches with me at Baylor who is also a practicing psychiatrist at our VA Medical Center in Waco. And Lee and I were talking about it last week, and he said, there is no question that we are living in the most anxious period in my lifetime, and he's nearly 70. So there's no question that this is the most anxious period in my lifetime. And it is having this just a deleterious effect on not people's just their mental health. It is having a deleterious effect on their physical health. We are hearing all over the place of people. We laughed about it last year. You know, a doctor friend of mine said it this way. It must have been about May or maybe early June of last year. She said, "I've got the COVID-19." And I said, "Roxanne, what? Why are you in my house?" She said, "No, I don't mean that COVID-19. She said, "I mean the COVID-19. Only in my case, it's probably 25 or 30. And that's part of what anxiety has done, is that we have gone to our comforts, and our comforts sometimes are Lay's and Snickers and things like that. And so we're living in a very anxious period. I think it is very important for us to help people give labels to that. Here's a funny thing about fear and anxiety that I began discovering as a hospice counselor, is that when we actually put words to our fears and anxiety, it sucks the power out of them. That part of what scares us so much is this abstract, undefined, unlabeled experience. So when I began to say, these are the things that frighten me, I'm scared I'm going to get sick, or I'm scared that my loved one is going to die, or I'm scared about this, or I'm scared about that, or in one man's case, I'm frightened that if I become ill, I will die alone. That was his greatest fear. Or one woman who said, I'm really scared that I'm going to be all alone in the last part of my life. I see what that's doing to my friends who are so isolated. And and our generation, I mean those of us who are, well, I started to say those of us who are under 50, but since I'm not, I guess I have to say those of you who are under 50. We like to talk about, we can just Zoom, or we can just get online and do something. And what I realize is that our most vulnerable citizens have no access to that. They may have sight impairments or hearing impairments that make it nigh on impossible to connect online. They may have no money to buy internet service, and that's an equal opportunity employer across the generations. I think of my mother-in-law, who is 89, has never touched a computer in her life and wouldn't know where to start, and has no real, probably at this point, the cognitive ability to learn how to do that. If she were not living in our home, she would be completely isolated, and her number is one of millions. And there are many fears and anxieties that are related to this. And one of the things that we absolutely have to do is we have to acknowledge and label those things, which leads to this third piece, and that's to make sure that we are constantly developing spiritual and cultural humility. By the way, cultural humility is the word of choice this week. It changes. It's been at least 4 different things since I started working in cross-cultural work. But the word we use now is cultural humility. I happen to like that a lot better than the term it has replaced, which was cultural competence. We used to talk about becoming culturally competent, but that implied somehow that I could somehow get into the skin of a person who had grown up in mainland China, for example, and spoke Mandarin. And that I could somehow, by learning enough, I could become competent to actually take care of that person. And what I have learned is that no, I really cannot become ever competent in another person's culture. I can't even figure out my own family planning my brother's funeral. How in the world could I expect to learn somebody else's culture? But this I do know. While I may not be able to be competent in understanding you, I can be humble in approaching you. I can come to you and say, you have grown up in a different socioeconomic status than me, or you have grown up in a different ethnic community than me, or you've grown up in a different part of the world than me, or you've spoken a different language than me, or you've had just different kinds of experiences than me. Some of you people probably went to Clemson. And those of us who did our undergrad at LSU or teach at Baylor just don't even get you. All right, you're just a world apart, right? We have no idea how you even think. I cannot be competent to understand Clemson Tigers.
That's right, they're not the real ones.
That's right. The LSU Tigers are the real Tigers. But my point is not that. My point is what I can do is come with great humility and say, what is it like to grow up in South Carolina? What must that be like? Or what is it like to be part of this community in this generation? For those of us who are under 40, to ask some of the folks who have lived here through the worst part, maybe of the 50s and 60s, to say, what was that like? I hope I don't embarrass him when I say it. I should have asked him, but oh well. John McAfee was telling me last night about the first time their firm was called by an African American family to serve. And the family wanted a photograph put in the obituary. And some people called and said, we're transferring our pre-needs. I dare say that most of the white people in this room who are under 40 can hardly even imagine that. And I'm telling you that those of us who are 50 and above, who grew up in the Deep South, and especially our brothers and sisters in this room who are of African American descent, not only have heard it, but they have lived it. And we who are younger or whiter or whatever can come to those and say, would you teach me what it is like? And I'll tell you what, folks, when we do that, we are doing spiritual work of the highest order. Teach me what I need to know. Here's the third principle. It is to fit spiritual meaning squarely into your understanding of loss. There are some things that we know about grief. The next slide lays out 4 of those, and I'm going to talk about these 4 things, and then we're going to take a break. Are you ready? So there are 4 things that I think we are pretty certain of these days we know about loss. The first of those is that there are no definitive stages to the grief process. Now, don't get me wrong. We have many different ways to describe grief. But one thing that the bereavement caregiving community is united about, and we have been for nigh on to 50 years. Now, this is not something new last week. The bereavement caregiving community, those of us who make our living thinking about researching, practicing clinically, it is our full-time gig. It is not part-time. It is not a hobby. It is what we do. We have known all of my career of 37 years and then some that grief does not proceed in any kind of linear, step-by-step, stage-by-stage model. We have known it. We are certain of it. We have never found even one shred of empirical evidence that would suggest that grief does proceed in some stepwise fashion. Never. There have been literally thousands, actually now tens of thousands of studies done of bereaved people, some a very small cohort, some of hundreds and even thousands of huge population studies. We have never found even one shred of evidence that it happens that way. You might be interested to know when Elizabeth Kubler-Ross popularized her 5 stages of dying back in 1969, you know how it happened? Macmillan came to her and said, "Dr. Ross, would you write a book about your work with bereaved people?" And she needed a framework to organize it. She actually said in an interview in 1981, you can find it on YouTube if you go to YouTube and search Elizabeth Kubler-Ross 1981 Princeton, I believe you'll come to the lecture in which she said, I dreamed it up based on my conversations with grieving people. There's nothing particularly magical about those stages. Now, she did not ever back away from the fact there were defined stages, but my point is there's never been any evidence that it was otherwise. There's never been any. Now, that doesn't keep fundamentals of nursing textbooks from talking about the stages of grief, and it doesn't keep most pastoral care classes and seminaries from talking about the stages of grief. And my son, who is a medical student at the University of Michigan, said that in his doctoring class, they talked about what? The stages of grief. Greg said he about came out of the chair. Well, he grew up in my home. What do you expect, right? So I do think he kindly corrected the professor later, and the professor actually indicated some appreciation for Greg's correction before he flunked him. No, not really, but no, he actually did say, and the professor actually reached out to me and said, you know, your son said that you're privy to some of the newer research. And I'm thinking, well, it's not that new. We've been saying this since 1972, but be that as it may, here it is kind of thing. Well, anyway, grief doesn't work that way. Boy, it would be nice. Wouldn't it be nice if we could say, yeah, you do this, and then you do this, and you do this, and then you do this, because when I got to number 4 of this 5-stage model, I would know I was 80% of the way home. Boy, wouldn't that be nice? It just doesn't work. That's the only problem. I've discovered there are a lot of things that sound really good in theory that when you get to actually talking to human beings, you discover they're not that simple, right? Here's another thing we know about grief. We know that resilience is the norm, not the exception. George Bonanno, in his wonderful book called The Other Side of Sadness, published now about 10 years ago. George is at Columbia, a colleague of mine. George talked about how in these huge population studies that he had done and that others of his team had done, they had found, and we're talking 10 or 15,000 bereaved people altogether, that they had found that really a very small subset of people, a year and a half after the death of a loved one, and these are spousal and parental bereavements, that a year and a half, certainly after the loss, that most of these people were still, or very few of these people were not highly functional again. That it was the exception that people were really struggling in their grief. Now, that does not mean that we are not still grieving at all. I think grief goes on for the rest of our life, but they were able to acclimate that grief. They were able to enfold that grief into their life, that loss, in such a way that they were actually able to function in the world. And they were carrying on a job, and they've got, their relationships are good. And yes, holidays may still be bad, but by and large, they are doing pretty well. And that's the norm. The norm is not. Now, the problem is when you're a psychotherapist, and many of us work exclusively with bereaved people or largely with bereaved people, and one of the things I've discovered in my career is you begin, if all you ever take care of is zebras, you assume everybody's a zebra. The fact that most pastures are filled with horses and there's only a zebra that happens out there once in a while. The problem is when all you ever take care of is zebras, you think everything's a zebra. And the reality is, most of the people who come to see us who are clinical counselors are the people who are really struggling. And so we make the assumption, oh, everybody in the world must be. And we forget that every study that has been done shows that right at 90% of all bereaved people are doing just fine. And in fact, I have a strong and abiding confidence that a large percentage of that 90%, if they came to see me, I would do nothing more than muck it up. And I got news for you. It would be the same way if they came to see you. The reality is that most people, with the support of their family, if it is decent, or their support community around them, if it is not, the support of the people who know them well help them get through grief. I was telling the bereaved people last night about my mother, who after my dad died in 1993, I gave her exactly 6 weeks to join a bereavement group. And when she didn't yet, I began to apply a little subtle pressure. First, it was, Mom, I think a bereavement group would really be good for you. Why don't you think about it? Okay, I'll think about it. A few weeks later, when she had not moved on that yet, I applied slightly more pressure and I said, Mom, I think a bereavement group would really be good for you. She was living in Baton Rouge. We were in Southern California. I said, I think it'd be really good for you. I could call my friend Amy Thibodeau over at Hospice of Baton Rouge, and she could probably refer you to a great group. And my mother said, Bill, I have enough problems of my own. Why do I want to go listen to everybody else's? And I honestly didn't have an answer for that. Well, she came to visit us I guess it was a couple of months after that. It's now been close to 5, 6 months maybe since Dad died. I thought, now's my chance. I'd take her to one of my greatest widows group, and I had some wonderful ones over the years. These ladies who they were wonderful to each other. They were this amazing support community. I thought, my mother is going to go to that group. She is going to fall headlong in love with the group process, and she is going to go back to Baton Rouge and join 6 or 8 of them, just like that. She came to my group. She participated appropriately. On the way back, I was taking her home before I went back to the office. She didn't offer any evaluation. I couldn't wait to hear it, so I thought I'd ask. So I said, well, what'd you think? She said, well, I'm glad it works for them, but it didn't do much for me. And I thought, fine, old woman. I'm going all over North America talking to people about the wonders of grief groups and how you should lead one and how everybody ought to be in one and how they are lifesavers for widowed people and yada, 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 yada. And someday, someplace, probably when I'm in Greenville, South Carolina, someone's going to come up to me and say, oh, Dr. Hoy, your mother is widowed. I'm curious now. I'm sure she's in a grief group, right? And I'm going to have to hang my head in shame and say, no, my own mother would not go to one. She won't follow my advice. So a few weeks later, I called. It was during football season, and I phoned on Sunday afternoon because sometime, a widowed woman had told me that Sunday afternoons are horrible when you've lost your life's mate. So I called most every Sunday afternoon. And this day, I don't know, I started at 2 and maybe 2:30 and then 2:35 and then 2:37 and then 2:38 and then 2:38 and a half. And finally she answered. I think it was after 3 o'clock. And of course, my question to her was, where have you been? Just like she asked me a few times in my younger life. And she said, the girls and I decided to go to Jackson today and try out a new restaurant. Now, Jackson's a little town about 30 miles from Baton Rouge. You don't just bebop up there after church on Sunday for lunch. And furthermore, the only girls in my mother's life were my daughter, who was at that time about 7 or 8 months old, and my brother, who lived in San Diego, had a daughter, and his little girl was about 3. And I knew they were both home with us in Southern California. They were not in Baton Rouge. I had no idea who these girls were. And I said, what girls? And she said, oh, it's Margie and Mildred and Dorothy and me. And I said, since when? And she said, oh, well, we get together most every Sunday. The Sunday after we buried your dad, that was Mother's Day weekend, you were all here in church with me, but the next week I was by myself. And I can picture it as she said it, sitting all alone in that pew of the Winburn Avenue Baptist Church where she and my dad had shared for the better part of 50 years. And Margie came up to her and said, Lily Mae, there's a little group of us girls, and we know what it is like on Sunday afternoon when you have lost your life's mate. And we go to lunch, and sometimes we go watch a football game for old time's sake. We'd love for you to come and be a part of that little group. All the time I'm trying to get my mother in a grief group. She's in one. A lot better than any I could have created for her. Because these women know the life, and they knew each other's husbands. And furthermore, they are making sense. They are this supportive community around her. It was a few years later, I don't remember, 4 or 5 maybe, I call my brother, or I get a message from my brother. He lives in San Diego. He's some big dude with the LSU Alumni Association. He's been to Baton Rouge, I know that, for the weekend. My mom had told me that he was coming. My brother also long since gave up on being a Baptist and became a Unitarian. He does not do Baptist church well anymore. So just for fun, when I would talk to him, I'd say, so, did you go to church with Mom yesterday while you were there? Well, so I have a message from him on Monday morning on my phone, and it says essentially this: little brother, it's Bob. You owe me big. Click. Well, that kind of demands a call back, right? So I did. I called him back, and I said, so you were in Baton Rouge this weekend, huh? And he said, yes, I was. And I said, how was it? He said, it was fine. I said, you go to church with Mom yesterday? Yes, I did. How was it? Blessedly short, he said. But then I went out to lunch with Mom and her little group of blue hairs. There were 37 of them. Women, men. There, to my knowledge, have been at least 3 marriages out of that group. He said, we went to the worst seafood restaurant Baton Rouge has. That's obvious because they camped out for 2.5 hours. The only restaurant that can take 37 people on Sunday afternoon is the worst restaurant in town, if they're going to camp out all afternoon. But what is not lost on Bob or me, either one, was that community, not a professional, not her son who knows a good deal about grief, not a physician, not a social worker, not a marriage and family therapist, her community is who walked her through that loss. And oh, how I remember years after my dad's death, my mother had never pumped a gallon of gas in her life when Dad died. And she learned how. And then she started making gas pump disciples of her own. She taught multiple widowed ladies in that congregation who had never put gas in their own car how to do it. That's resilience. I think that it is important we know that ongoing sorrow is also the exception and not the rule. Now, I said it a while ago, holidays are tough for most bereaved people. Birthdays are very, very difficult. I realized that we will bury my brother tomorrow on the 5th anniversary of my mother's death. And so that comes with all kinds of baggage of its own. Holidays and special occasions, being back in the place where we have been before, all of those things carry with them their own senses of loss. But those are, for most of us, momentary times. My friend and colleague from the Northeast, Dr. Terry Rando, talks about them as tugs, temporary upsurges of grief. And they tug at our heart, but they're temporary. They don't last long. Oh my goodness, for a bereaved parent whose child died at 7, Christmas is never the same as it once was. But I meet hundreds of bereaved parents who have found adaptive ways to live in the light of that loss. And then finally, it is important we know that death, grief, and loss does not occur very often like it does on TV. Now, there are a couple of exceptions to that, but there aren't many. I don't know if you've noticed it or not, but almost everybody on TV who gets resuscitated with CPR walks out of the hospital before the episode is over. But statistically, what we know is that in hospital, CPR is effective for a patient to walk out of the hospital approximately 11% of the time. Barely 1 out of 10 patients who are resuscitated in the hospital survive even 2 weeks. And survival is measured as still having a pulse. And sometimes it's not that good of an outcome. The reality is that often our clients, our parishioners, our patients, all they've ever learned about grief before us is what they've seen on NBC or CBS or YouTube. And so it is really important for us to remember that part of being a clinician, a therapist, a bereavement counselor, a volunteer leading a grief group, or any other role we might cover, a large part of our job is to teach how grief really is and how grief really works, and to help people find hope and hopefulness for the future, and that grief is not a death sentence in and of itself, and that your life is not over unless you choose it to be, and that there is hope in loss. And when we come back from the break, I'm going to take just a few minutes to articulate a way that I have used to understand grief clinically, to kind of talk about it, to sort of say, here are the signposts that I'm watching for with my clients and patients and have been over the years. And we'll do that when we return in about 15 minutes. See you then. Miles to go before we sleep, so let's get to walking, right? So I said a while ago that I don't believe, as most of my colleagues would agree, that grief proceeds in any kind of predictable stepwise fashion. So what can we say about grief? I think what we can say about it is that it is this iterative, this integrative process. This process, if you might think about it this way, of walking through life that gets me from the you who used to be, or the me who used to be, to the me who is going to be. And that in many ways, grief helps me to make that transition. It is the gift that I believe we get as humans to be able to walk through life as we adapt to this loss. And it is an adaptive process. While I do not think that there are stages or steps, I do think there are signposts. There are some things that we as clinicians, as caregivers, as volunteers can look for. We can be aware that these are elements of the grief process that most people, one way or another, get done in grief. The reason I hesitate to talk about them in any way as steps or even tasks or stages or any of those kind of things is in part that implies a linearity. It implies that I do this one and then I do the next one and then I do the third one and then I do the fourth one and so on, which of course further implies that once I have done one and finished it, I've tied a nice bow on it and I move on to the next one. And that's not how grief works. Rather, what I think happens for us in grief is that we are doing all 4 of these things, and probably 36 others, all at the same time. It's part of why sometimes grieving people feel like they're losing their mind. It's because they're trying to balance all these different things simultaneously. And it is just how it is as we adapt to this loss. And it's just the way it works. I think in the first place, I think what we are doing, and one of the things I watch for in people is how are they remembering? Are they telling stories? Are they finding values? Most of us do that, and we do that very naturally. I personally get a little bit concerned on this remembering piece if people are failing to do this. The way I define remembering on that next slide, and I believe in your outline, is that it's the sharing of stories, it's the discovering of values that provides some enduring sense of who this person was in my life. When I tell the story of the person who I have cared about and to whom I have said goodbye, what I find is that what I am really doing in this remembering is that I'm not only telling a story, I'm supporting a set of values. And frequently what happens for us is we discover, this is something I learned from my dad. It is something I learned from my grandmother. It is something I learned from this person who has died, this friend, this colleague, or whatever. That's remembering. The second thing that I think we do in grief, I call it the signpost that I watch for is one of reaffirming, of finding the spiritual, the philosophical anchors that provide support for me in the loss, that provide some sense of, some semblance of I can hold on to this thing. Now, what I caution us to remember, and I especially caution those in the room who are clergy or who are attached to a faith community, and especially if most of the care you provide are to people who wear the same label that you do and are therefore part of the same faith community, is that we fail to understand that many times people are grappling deeply with this business of finding those anchors, that's sometimes very, very hard to do. And I may have my search for meaning short-circuited by well-meaning people within my community who tell me, well, a good Christian ought not think that way, or something of that kind. I had a woman in one of my groups early in my career, and she named the church in Long Beach that she was part of, and she said, Bill, I don't know if I will ever be able to go back to that church after last Sunday. And I said, my goodness, what happened last Sunday? And she said, well, she said, not a big church, but she said, I saw the pastor, and he grabbed me on the way out of church, and he said, oh, how are you doing? And I don't remember. It had maybe been 6 weeks since her husband had died, and he died very suddenly. May have been a traffic crash. I don't recall now, but it was sudden, probably violent. And she said, I said, Pastor, I'm really struggling. This is the hardest thing I've ever done. And he said he looked right into my eyes, and he said, well, Susan, or whatever her name was, I am here to tell you, if you will just have enough faith, this will not hurt. Now, maybe he didn't really say it. I pray he didn't, and that's just what she heard. I met him some months later. I think he probably really said it. He was just an idiot. He was a clerical idiot. And that probably wasn't the only really stupid thing that was theologically unsound that he ever said. For those of you who are pastors, if that is your model, and you are misquoting Paul's words to the Thessalonians when he said, we grieve but not as those who have no hope, please notice what he said, we grieve but not as those who have no hope. He did not say we grieve as those who have no hope, okay? And I get the proof text of that from his letter to the Philippians. When he says this startling thing, he's talking to his Philippian friends, and he says, you've asked about our friend and brother Epaphras, and you had heard correctly. He has been sick and has nearly died. But God saved him, listen to this, and me. in that he has saved me sorrow upon sorrow. Paul knew what it was like to grieve. So did Jesus. So did most of the stalwarts of the faith in our faith and in the other faith communities I know of around the world. The Buddha said it. Hindus have said it for centuries. It's well taught in Islam that there is very significant challenge to our belief system when somebody dies, especially if they die in unexplainable, unexpected ways. What reaffirmation calls us to do is to find the anchors, but part of that journey usually is holding the stuff up that we've always believed to the cold light of day and saying, does this sustain me in this moment? And sometimes we find it does, and sometimes we discover it does not, and we need to replace it with something else. A third signpost I watch for in the grief process with folks who are experiencing loss is how are they doing with realizing. Now, Kubler-Ross talked about denial back as her first stage, and I think many of us assume that this confrontation between denial and reality is a once-and-done thing, when in fact it is not at all. In fact, we discover that over the years, many of us kind of have this confrontation with reality again and again all through our lives, and we sort of say, oh yeah, that's right, he's gone. For years after my dad died, I found myself in the summer when the air conditioner in my car was not cooling quite like it should. You know, I was a young clinician, didn't have any money, so I drove jalopies. And I would think, oh, I ought to call Dad and ask him what to do about this because he fixed air conditioners in cars. And then I would remember, oh, no, I can't call him and ask him that. I watched my dad die. I saw him in the casket. I went to his funeral. In one sense, there was no denying that he was dead. I was not living in some fantasy world that he was still alive. And yet, and most of our bereaved people, if we will listen intently to what they say, will tell us that's their story and they're sticking to it. And then, of course, the fourth thing that I think we all do in grief is we say goodbye. And I watch not only for the remembering that goes on month after month, year after year, and the seeking meaning and the reaffirmation that goes on month after month, year after year, and the confrontation between denial and reality that goes on month after month and year after year. I watch also for how are people doing with saying goodbye. And one of my fears, and you know, I hope you don't take this in anything other than the intention that I send it forth in. One of my great concerns with the language change that I have seen in my generation around funerals is that we may be working really hard to pretend this doesn't hurt. So we don't have funerals in lots of communities anymore. We have celebrations of life, which sort of takes the emphasis off the fact that there's somebody dead. That's the reason we got together. One of the things that I'm engaged in 2 research projects right now, but one of them is examining the very unique customs about which I have learned much and am fascinated constantly that are practiced in many, if not most, African American communities around the United States. When somebody dies, these funerals are funerals. Now, they're called homegoings, and sometimes pastors will refer to them as we're celebrating. But I'll tell you what, when you go to one of them, you know there is no pretending going on here. The dead guy is invited into the church, and he's laying in a box up front. There's no pretending. I'm telling you, folks, we can talk, and I know some of you are not big fans of the body at the funeral or the casket being open. I hear it. I hear it, but I'm going to just say it out loud right here and right now. When there is a dead guy laying in a box in the front of the church, there is no denying the fact that why we have gathered here today is not regular Sunday church. It is unmistakable when there's a dead guy up front. We can pretend when we've got a really nice photograph, and I don't know if you've noticed it or not, but this person can be old and wrinkled and decrepit as can be, and the photograph we stick up front or put in the paper is what they looked like when they were 27. Have you noticed how we do that? I don't know why, because there is nobody alive that remembers them looking like that. But somehow we think if we just pretend he ain't dead, he ain't. And I'm here to say it doesn't work that way. And all of our pretending and our language, and let's just kind of whisk the dead away and pretend that it didn't really happen, isn't helping us as a culture to get our hands around and our hearts around the fact that grief hurts. I hear it when families say, don't play any of that music. Just makes us cry and we don't want to cry. I'm sorry. If you haven't cried at a memorial service, it hadn't been a good memorial service. The folks that were leading it have failed you. It ought to cause us to do two things. It ought to cause us to mourn deeply, and it ought to cause us to have great hope and rejoicing at the life that was lived. But we cannot do the second until we have done the first. Otherwise, it's just a birthday party or a retirement shindig. So whether we are helping folks tell stories, and we do that when we ask them, tell me about how the two of you met. Tell me where you loved to go when you were dating. Tell me about what it was like to grow up in South Carolina in the 30s. What was World War II like? We don't have many we can ask that of anymore. What must it have been like to have fought in Korea? What was it like to come back from Vietnam and be shunned by the society because of the war in which you fought? Would you tell me the story? And I'll tell you what, something happens for us as caregivers when we do that. Not only do we provide great care, but oh, by the way, our own lives are enriched because of the story that we get to hear and to be part of. Now, we are 5 slides behind, so whoever's running the slides, would you run on ahead to the one that has a compass and a few words on it? That's the one, thank you. All right. So, here's what I'd like us to do is to change the goal. Change the goal from recovering to integrating. You might notice in the middle of that compass on whatever page of your outline it is, it must be about page 3 or 4 or something. You might notice that what I've done there is I have put in the middle of that compass the word integrating. And what we are doing there is simply that. We are not about trying to recover from this loss. We are about trying to figure out how to enfold this loss into the rest of our lives. It is not about getting over it. It is not about moving on. And goodness knows it is not about closure. In fact, just for the record, if you say to a bereaved parent, I'm hoping that you're going to be able to get closure on your daughter's death, may I respectfully suggest to you that as you utter those words, you step back out of arm's length reach so you don't get cold cocked. Because there are fewer things that will infuriate a bereaved parent more than suggesting that the death of their child young adult or otherwise, is something about which they might be able to close. There are a few words I think we'd be wise to banish from our vocabulary once and for all. Words like closure and recovery. Words like stages. Let's just get rid of them. They're of no use as we take care of bereaved people. All right, here's my fourth of the 8 strategies, and it is to help yourself and others find meaning without minimizing this loss. I don't know what the slide says, so I'm just going to wait for it to show up. There it is. All right. Except we lost a slide somewhere. There should be a number 4. Well, maybe there's not. All right. Well, nonetheless, we'll proceed as if there were. All right? Think about the word minimize for a moment. Your outline has it right, even if the slides aren't. Think about the word minimize for a moment. When you hear the word minimize, what other words pop into your head? Now, you're just going to have to shout them out loudly because we're not going to bring the mics around just yet. Unimportant. Wait, I heard about 3 at a time. Get smaller, all right? Lesser. Less than. Trivialize. One more time. Devalued. All right, well, you got the picture, right? We can move on. All right, now, does somebody around have the mics? This is where I'd like to have the mics. Somebody have them? Yep, they're coming with them. Here's what I want you to do right now. In your notes, I want you to write down your absolute favorite horrible thing that people say to grieving people. What is the absolute worst you've ever heard, all right? How have they made that loss less by this statement? Just write it down, your absolute favorite. Lynn Kelly, some months after the death of her husband, quite a few years ago now, published a book entitled Don't Ask for the Dead Man's Golf Clubs. Apparently someone did after her husband died. What's the worst thing you've ever heard? Write it down. All right, whoever's got the mics are coming with them now. Just wave them down so we can hear up here in front. Here we come. All right. Okay, here we go.
This too shall pass.
This too shall pass. Oh, yes, of course. All right, here we go.
It's been 6 years. How come you haven't gotten over his
Oh,
death?
it's been 6 years, or it's been 6 weeks. How come you haven't gotten over it? Now, you see, this person's really working hard to be a good counselor because she read somewhere that you should ask a question. So she did ask a question. Why haven't you gotten over it yet, right? It's just not the kind of question we want. What else? Yeah.
3-year-old killed in a car accident. Jesus just needed another rose in his rose garden.
Oh, my gosh. Jesus needed another rose in his rose garden. All right? Yeah, Mike?
Mine was going to be close to that. God needed another angel.
God needed another angel.
At least you had them for blank, blank, blank.
At least he...
Lived.
Oh, lived a long time, lived 80 years. Yeah.
I completely understand.
Wait, one more time. I didn't see where it came from, so I couldn't hear it.
I completely understand.
Oh, I completely understand. And no, you don't, because you weren't married to my spouse. You weren't the child. Even 2 children grew up in the same home. I guarantee you they had a different mother. They related to her differently. Therefore, their grief is different. Do they understand some things? Sure, but they do not understand everything. And I guarantee you, as an outsider to this equation, I do not understand your experience with loss. Somebody else.
I don't know why you're crying.
I don't know why you're
I don't
crying.
know why you're crying. God is your mother, father, sister, brother now.
Yeah, God is your sister, mother, father, sister, brother, whatever. Yeah. Get over it already. Yeah. Okay?
He's in a better place.
He's in a better place. Oh, of course. Now, okay, and we could go on all day and have a lot more fun, I'm sure. One of my favorites, I started quite a few years ago awarding the absolute worst thing that I'd heard currently. I gave it an award. I called it my Friends of Job Award. Some of you know the story of Job. And, you know, Job was having a pretty hard time in life until his friends came, and then things got worse. And you might, if you've ever read the book of Job, you might think, with friends like that, who needs enemies, right? And they told him why his theology was wrong and how he surely had done things that must certainly have caused all this, and on the list went. So anyway, I started giving this to whatever the world's worst. For many years, it was the young man whose wife was killed in a car crash 6 weeks after they were married. On autopsy, they discovered she was 2 weeks pregnant. She was brand new pregnant. So he lost a wife and a baby he didn't even know he had 6 weeks after the wedding. A man came up to him at the grave and said, well, you weren't married very long, so at least it won't take so long to get over her. And that for many years had the Friends of Job Award. But over the years, I've heard some really doozies that probably even eclipse that one. My point is this: if it starts with at least or if only, you could pretty well guess you ought not say it. Now, I realize I'm preaching to the choir here, right? I mean, none of us would say any of these kinds of things. But one of the things I have found very useful to do, and when I've led bereavement groups, we do it at least 4 or 5 times a year. I will start a group by saying, what is the absolutely most horrific thing you have been told in your grief? And oh, it would just curl your hair to hear what some people have been told. And I think and by the way, when they say it in the company of other grieving people and people go, oh, or oh my gosh, or how could anybody say that? There is real camaraderie in that, and it becomes this very supportive kind of thing. Minimizing, what it does is it thwarts meaning making. It keeps me from being able to really grapple with meaning. Here's why. When I say I'm really struggling with where God is, and my caregiver responds by saying, I don't know why you're so upset. God is your mother, father, sister, brother, cousin, or whatever it was you said there. Well, what does that do to my search for meaning? It shuts it down. Well, at least it shuts it down in sharing it with you. The problem is it doesn't shut it down in grappling with it. And now, on top of being a person in grief, I think there's something wrong with me. I think not only am I really sad, but I must not be a very good person of faith, or I must not be psychologically intact, or I must not be a very good son or daughter or husband or whatever, and fill in the blank. I must not be a very good whatever. That's what happens to us when our loss is minimized. And what I find is that we as clinicians and volunteers in the caregiving field are constantly battling against stupid stuff that has been uttered by well-meaning friends. We are constantly doing battle with it. And the only way to know it is to ask, so what's the dumbest thing anybody's told you today? I found myself, when I was still seeing patients individually in grief, usually pretty horrific losses. My specialty, the last 5 years I was at Pathways, I took care of exclusively bereaved parents whose teenagers had died violently. In Los Angeles, you have enough of any one subset of people, you can have a whole practice doing something that specific. And I took care of literally hundreds of bereaved parents over the last few years of my career there. And I found myself over that period learning in every in every conversation with every parent, every time, to say, so what's the dumbest thing anybody said to you this week or since the last time we met? And it was really interesting how that often provided the impetus for what it was we needed to talk about during that next 50 minutes as we worked through strategies for how to manage this loss. That's amazing. And it's because of well-meaning friends, which you realize is a paradox, because I was just talking about how great support communities is what usually gets us through it. You know, I don't even remember some of the stupid stuff that I was told after the car crash that I was in 5 years ago, in which a friend of mine of 45 years and her husband were both killed. I don't even remember some of the stupid stuff. There are benefits to a head injury. There's one of them. But I do know I was told some pretty stupid stuff. My wife remembers some of it. You can ask her sometime. She talked when I was here a couple of years ago about trauma, and she talked about that experience for us. So anyway. All right. Well, let me show you a chart on the next, it's the next about 3 slides, but it's on one page in your outline. So my friend Bob Niemeyer and his colleague Jim Gillies, quite a number of years ago now, started saying, you know, whenever something unexpected happens, we have to find a way to make sense of it. And that's a very elaborate chart, I realize. Let me just show you how it works. Here's how it works. So something has happened. And what I have to do at that is I have to say my pre-loss meaning structure, the beliefs that I've always held, the ones I hold up to the light, are adequate. So my experience with my brother's death last week so far, I anticipate it will be this way throughout, but so far my meaning structures are intact. My faith has not been challenged by that. My sense of rightness somewhat has, but that's a long, detailed story that I won't get into just now. But by and large, my meaning structures are intact in Don's loss. It was not so when Golden died in the back seat of my car when we were rear-ended by a 47,000-pound truck. My meaning structures were very upset by that. This is not supposed to happen. I was doing the right thing. It actually took working with a colleague of mine because, interestingly enough, I could not do for myself what I had done for thousands of other people over the last, at that point, 30-some-odd years. Isn't that amazing? That's because grief and trauma is not done well when we try to do it on our own. We need the community. We need colleagues. Even though she said, she was parroting my words. She was saying to me some of the things I've said to patients, not once or twice, but literally hundreds of times. I thought you're lip syncing me, woman. I've said that, but I couldn't say it to me. I had to have somebody help me do that. Isn't that amazing? All right, so some losses, our meaning structures remain intact. When they do, great, that no problem. It's probably not going to in any way be complicated spiritually or making meaning of it. But if they do not remain intact, then we've got to do something with them. We have to examine those beliefs, which leads me to the next slide, kind of the middle of that chart on your page. What Bob and Jim say is that we really are faced with 3 alternatives. One of those is to try to make sense out of this. A second one is that we try to find some benefit. That's kind of the silver cloud, the silver lining in the dark cloud kind of idea, you know. And by the way, when I say to a bereaved person, at least he lived a long life, that is not appropriate. When a bereaved person says to me, I'm glad that my dad lived a long life, or at least he lived a long life, that's not minimizing. That's the grieving person making meaning. That's perfectly okay. I just can't make meaning for them. That's what I'm trying to say here, right? It's okay for them to say it, it's just not okay for me to say it. And then the third one is that sometimes the way we make sense or make meaning out of a loss is we find some change in our own identity. I think I told the group yesterday, but I honestly can't remember now. When I've spoken to the third group in 24 hours, I honestly may have already told this story. So if I have today, please just smile and pretend like you're hearing it for the first time. But I said to somebody recently that, I sustained a pretty significant head injury after that car crash. I did not speak publicly for a long time. Even when I started speaking publicly, my wife would travel with me because I couldn't drive. And she would travel with me, and she would sit in the back of the room, and she had two symbols that I understood. This one, that meant you're chasing rabbits, knock it off. And this one, filters, because I lost those. And I was very apt to say whatever was on my mind at the moment. And I made some of the most horrendous political statements in that time. And frankly, people were very kind and understanding that, he's brain damaged. It's okay. We'll overlook it. And I still get by with that periodically. It's why people just smile when I tell the same story the second time in an hour. And those are things that I will deal with the rest of my life. The neurologist tells me that I've gotten pretty much all the gains that I will get, that what I've got is what I've got. But what I have discovered is that I have a sense of understanding about trauma and grief that has been transformational in the way I provide care. I understand people, not that I can say I know what you're going through, because I still can't say that, but I understand in a way that I never did when it was simply a theoretical understanding. My identity has in some ways been changed. Yes, I am a person with an invisible disability. Some of you didn't know that yet this morning. If you'd been here last night and you have heard me speak for many years, you probably would have detected it, because as the day wears on, I become more tired and I lose words and I can't find thoughts and I trail off without being able to figure out quite where I was going. And that will be with me the rest of my life. And it happened abruptly on February the 16th, 2017. But a couple of years ago, 2 years, maybe 3 years after the crash, I was speaking, and I knew that I had not done a particularly stellar job of what I said that day. I was trying to present new material. Most of this is real old stuff, and I have very little trouble getting old stuff out. But new stuff I have a lot of trouble with. And this hospice chaplain, whom I've known for many years, came up to me and he said, "Bill, you are right. I am sad to say that you are right and you have lost a step. You are not as sharp as you were. I see it. I understand it. You do not know what a gift it was for a colleague to say to me, I see you, I hear you, and I agree with you." But then he didn't leave it there. He said, "But let me tell you what I do see." He said, "What I do see is that in spite of the fact you can't always get the words out right, you speak with a level of credibility and authenticity and a sense of compassion that I never saw in you before. And if that is not a gift in grief, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know what is." And I think that's part of what we do when we are seeking to make meaning in the midst of loss. If those meanings are helpful, we find that our levels of distress goes down. If the new meanings are not particularly helpful, then we circle back through and we look for new meanings, more meanings. When you and I try to make meaning of another person's loss, it short circuits that process. That's why I tell pastors you have to be very, very careful when you try to speak what you say is truth in trauma. So here's an example. I barely remember this event, but my wife assures me it really happened, and it happened this way. At Golden's funeral 5 days after the crash that injured my brain and my hip and ended her life, the pastor of this very large Assemblies of God church where she and her husband attended in Waco stood in the pulpit at her funeral, 700 people in this room, and said words approximately like this. I bet some of you are wondering today where God was on I-35 last Thursday afternoon. And what I thought at the moment, and I do remember this, what I thought at that moment was, finally, this pastor has been talking for 40 minutes, and he is finally talking about what I think 700 people in this room are wondering. She was a sainted woman, celebrated Christian author, had just signed a contract with Thomas Nelson to do 4 more books, well known all over the English-speaking world, and her life cut short. And I thought, finally, he is going to deal with what we're wondering. Alas, here is what he said. He said, I bet some of you are wondering where God was last Thursday afternoon. And I'm going to tell you in all that is holy, he said. I'm going to try to do his accent. Put that demonic thought right out of your mind. Because God doesn't make no mistakes. My wife says, I do not remember this. That in a bit louder than a stage whisper, I said, oh, geez! And everyone in the church turned around to look. I don't know that that really happened, but Debbie swears that it really did. That's trying to make meaning of another person's loss. And it's not even a very good theological meaning in my way of thinking. All right, here's the 5th one, is be on the lookout for complicated spiritual grief. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but my Bob Niemeyer, same guy as did this chart I was looking at a moment ago, and one of his students, Lori Burke, who is now, I believe, has followed Bob's work. I believe she is now teaching and practicing at University of Memphis. But Lori was the one actually who coined this phrase, complicated spiritual grief. We talk a lot about complicated grief in psychotherapy these days. We spend a lot of time talking about how grief goes awry, it gets complicated. We now have in the new text revision of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, affectionately known as the DSM, we now have a code number for something called prolonged grief disorder. So we can actually start billing insurance later this year for that. Happy day for all of us. Well, anyway, Lori said it's different than that. This is not prolonged grief disorder. This is, I am really struggling because of the compromise in how I make meaning of this loss. I may be not having any trouble telling the story. If you think about my compass from a few minutes ago, I'm probably able to tell the story. I'm probably coming to terms with the reality of the death and the pain of grief. I'm probably doing okay with saying goodbye. I'm not trying to keep the corpse at home or any of those kinds of things. Where I'm struggling is over there in the, what would that be, westerly direction, that piece I call reaffirming. That's where I'm really struggling. That's what complicated spiritual grief is I'm really struggling with that. And it may also be that everybody around me is trying to talk me out of being sad right now with whatever their spiritual platitudes are that they trounce out to try to support me in this. They think that they are helping, but in fact they are not. Usually it is a violation of our basic assumptive worldview, as Ronnie Janoff Boltman put it several years ago. My basic assumptions about the way the world is supposed to work have gone awry. Usually, there is in this the precipitation of a spiritual crisis. So I listen for clues in this. I'm not sure that I can trust God anymore, a patient might say. Or, I think I've given up on all that religious stuff. Or, I used to believe. What I'm guessing is what I'm going to hear in the follow-up to those kinds of phrases is some description of complicated spiritual grief. I'm struggling with making meaning of a loss. All right, well, there's a sixth one here. No, I should say before I run ahead, sorry, I already did, that this is often complicated by the loss of rituals. I think that's it's not the only piece that has made the last 2 years so difficult, but it is a very important part of that. When we lose rituals, you see, the reason we need ritual and ceremony, the reason, I don't know if you know this or not, but we think we're so very creative as Americans with the way we do our celebrations of life and all that. When you look at the elements of a contemporary memorial service, it isn't really very much different than the funeral account in Genesis 49 and 50 when the patriarch Jacob died, which depends on which theological camp you belong to, but most scholars would say that's somewhere between 2,900 and 4,000 years ago. Oh, we think we're so terribly creative. We're not very creative at all. We're doing basically the same thing humans have been doing as long as humans have been writing about how they said goodbye to their dead. You light a candle and you think you're so creative. No, religious people have been lighting candles at funerals for longer than any of us can remember, or our grandparents could have remembered, or our great-great-great-great-grandparents have remembered. Putting flowers around, my goodness, we have tombs of Neanderthals that had flora gathered around the skeleton, the fossilized skeleton. At least 60,000 years we've been doing that as humans. FTD doesn't have anything on it. 1-800-Flowers. I did an interview for them a few weeks ago, and I said, they've got a blog post up about it. I said, honestly, you guys aren't so special. They didn't publish that on their blog, by the way, when I said that. But you guys aren't so special. I mean, we've been doing flowers for a long time, long before there was an internet or even a toll-free number for 1-800-Flowers. We've been doing this a while. And so when we lose those ritual elements, see, the power of ritual is that they provide some level of predictability in the cold-hearted chaos of early grief. I think that's the brilliance of, call it a traditional African American homegoing, where in many culture, in many communities, the pastor precedes the family down the aisle at the beginning of the funeral. If you want to see one of these done really well, it's long, but watch the funeral for George Floyd last year. And you will watch, and if you're like me, you will absolutely be amazed as Pastor Rufus made his way down the aisle, quoting, I'm going to say probably 35 or 40 different texts, all of them from memory. And that provides stability and predictability in the midst of chaos. Gathering with family at the end of that funeral for what in many places is called the parting view. Gathering with family and friends for the repast after the cemetery, the interment is done, and going back to the family home or the church and eating this wonderful comfort food that's been provided often by ladies in the church and the community. All of those very predictable, sequential kinds of things provide some sort of stability for us when all is crazy about us. And so when we've lost that over the last couple of years, it has really done great damage to the way we make spiritual meaning. And there is, my hat's off to funeral service and the way you guys have done amazing jobs in adapting to that in what has been just an impossible experience. And yet, when we cannot gather and rub shoulder to shoulder, it isn't the same. Here's the sixth one, is to become attentive to your own and others' moral injury. Sorry, my vision just got very blurry there, so let me see if I can get it back. Okay. Moral injury has been defined, and there are many, but I like this definition. It is lasting emotional, psychological, social, behavioral, and spiritual impacts resulting from the involvement in some sort of tragedy where moral concern is beyond moral control. I first encountered nurses talking about moral injury 10 years ago maybe. And often it had to do with the nurse who was asked to participate in providing care to a patient. That was not the problem, but a patient who remained intubated long after all treatment was futile, but because of laws in that jurisdiction or unwillingness on the part of the family to admit that brain death had really occurred, were unwilling to extubate the patient. And that was the first time I heard about moral injury, but I've heard it many other times. I've heard about it just nonstop over the last year and a half as healthcare professionals have been called upon to try to, hold the phone while a patient hears, hopefully, words from out on the sidewalk. And social workers have been deeply morally injured. And chaplains who were told last year at the very beginning of the pandemic, you are not an indispensable healthcare worker, so we're not going to let you see patients. We can't afford to spend money on the PPEs for you, so you're not really important to the healthcare team. And those are all morally injurious things. And we have to be very attentive to that because that becomes spiritual for us. I don't have a remedy for it. I simply want to point it out. Be listening for you and your colleagues. Listen in yourself. Listen to those around you about what they're struggling with right now in terms of their own moral injury. Here's the seventh idea. It's to negotiate your boundaries for care with the spiritual care professionals who are on your team. How many of you in the room are healthcare chaplains? Could I see your hands? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, great. How many of you in the room work with a chaplain in whatever program you happen to work with, but you have that person on your team to whom you could refer? May I see your hand? Okay, about a third. So some of this may not be relevant for the rest of you, but maybe it will be at some point in the future, so I'm going to go ahead and talk about it anyway. And besides that, it's in the outline, and I get dinged down on the evaluations if I put stuff on the slides or in the outline and then I don't talk about it. So there are really kind of three elements to this that I wanted to talk about. One of them is to talk about who these people are, these folks that wear the mantle of spiritual care or pastoral support or chaplain in a healthcare setting. Because if you aren't one, you may be unaware of who these folks are. Most of the time in North America, if a person, not always, but most of the time, if a person wears the mantle of chaplain or a spiritual care coordinator in a hospice or a hospital or somewhere like that, more often than not, they're going to have at least a master's degree in practical theology. The common one in Protestant seminaries is called the Master of Divinity. They may have a master's in sacred theology if they're Catholic, or some other similar kind of thing. As a professional master's degree, it might interest you to know that the Master of Divinity is actually a 90 semester hour program. So it's just really, in terms of actual classroom and practical work, it is almost doctoral level training. It would be similar. It would be the same amount of time in school that we would talk about being a JD, a Juris Doctorate, a lawyer. So these folks are typically quite well educated. They've spent a lot of time after their baccalaureate degree was earned. In most cases, healthcare chaplains in North America have some level of clinical pastoral training. That would be supervised training, could be several thousand hours of supervised work, spanning usually 3 or 4 years before they are certified in that field. So if you see somebody with the initials BCC, which stands for Board Certified Chaplain, behind her or his name, you can bet that they have paid the price and they have spent a good number of years. They have been through the ringer. They know the field and they know it well, and they've practiced long. Usually these folks have a significant amount of ministry experience. Sometimes it's a lot of years in local congregation or parish ministry before they ever got to doing healthcare ministry. I've known of many chaplains who served a congregation for 30 or 40 years, then went back and did their clinical training so that they could become a healthcare chaplain, and did that at the very end of their life. My own brother is one of those people. He was 40 years in pastoral ministry, and then a couple of years ago, I'm going to say now, said to me, I'm really interested in hospice chaplaincy, and I want to look into that, and began the process, and had been working for a hospice in Baton Rouge while he was getting some additional training as well. He'd had a lot of training in the military as a chaplain, and pastoral care training himself and all of that. And so over the years, that's often what you get in a healthcare chaplain. And then I already mentioned the board certification piece, but you will often see that, especially in larger hospitals. The director of pastoral care frequently, they may have 12 chaplains, but you can bet one, and sometimes many of them, are going to have some kind of board certification. I say that because I think a lot of people seem to be of the mind that, well, gosh, you can just kind of hang your shingle out as a healthcare chaplain. And there are some healthcare organizations for sure. I mean, they've hired people who were selling used cars yesterday. But for the most part, you're going to get folks who have some modicum of training, education, and experience in the field. And that leads me onward then to talk about some hints for how we work with them. That might also imply that these folks actually know grief really well, and I find that's sort of a mixed bag. Some chaplains know grief and loss things really well, some not so much, because they just haven't done much work in that arena. But here are some hints that I think for the rest of us who work with these folks. Get to know them. Find out a little bit about who they are and what they do, what they're up to. I think it's really important that we get to know who they are. I learned this from a chaplain that I worked with long after I was no longer doing that kind of work. And he said, Bill, the longer I practice, the less time I spend with patients and the more time I spend supporting staff. And what this particular chaplain articulated was that as the level of moral injury goes up with the team, the amount of support necessary goes up exponentially with it. And I'm meeting a lot of chaplains that, especially during the pandemic, they weren't sitting around eating bonbons while they weren't able to see patients. They were instead spending hours and hours and hours and hours listening to stories and supporting staff. Some of you experienced that very thing last year, because one of the roles that Brenda took on for Thomas McAfee early in the pandemic was as a sounding board for an awful lot of hospital and hospice chaplains and social workers in the community that had nowhere else to turn. And so many of her hours, sometimes late into the night, was spent listening to those stories and hearing. That's the kind of work that chaplains frequently do. A second thing is that expect pastoral care staff to make spiritual assessments. I said this when I was a chaplain about 163 years ago, and I say it still. You know, I never once have put a scalpel in my hand and started to do cardiac surgery. And I can confidently say not one time in my entire 37-year career have I either done it or been asked to start an IV. To do either of those things would to be operating outside of my scope of practice and way outside of my lane. But for a physician or a nurse or a social worker to conduct a thorough spiritual assessment is to be operating out of your lane. And so you must. If you work for a hospice that sees the chaplain's assessment of the patient as superfluous, do not walk but run to the administrator's office this afternoon and demand that process be changed. There is no one on a hospice staff as well equipped to do that work. There is not a marriage and family therapist. There is not a social worker. There is not a nurse. There is not a physician. There is not a physical therapist or a home health aide as well equipped to hear those stories and to help patients make sense of them. If your chaplain's not like that, then maybe she or he needs to be replaced. But in all probability, that is the person who can most authoritatively conduct that assessment, change the strategy of your healthcare organization to make it so. That might mean, by the way, we have to hire more of them. And that might mean we have to ignore the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization standards that would suggest that a chaplain can take care of 60 patients. That's absolutely ludicrous nonsense. In no way or shape or form is that possible and provide good spiritual care. Thirdly, make early and frequent referrals. Many of those apparent psychological, pathological kinds of things are really not that at all. They are simply spiritual distress. What I listen for on a patient that I assume is struggling with a clinical anxiety disorder or a clinical depressive mood disorder, what I listen for is there some conflict in the way this person is making meaning? And if it is, I guarantee you, we can throw every kind of anxiolytic, that's an anti-anxiety, or antidepressant medication we want to at that patient, and we will not resolve that anxiety disorder or that depression because it is a spiritual issue related to making meaning. I guarantee it. I have watched it happen, and I am fairly convinced that the reason that our success rate with the use of antidepressant and anxiolytic medication is so very poor, only the best research says only about 30% of patients on them are any better a year later. Well, that's not a very good track record, frankly. The reality is that that's part of the issue. And one of the things I say to my colleagues in medicine, and I remind my students of this all the time, if the only tool you have is a hammer, then everything is going to look like a nail. And so if the only tool in my toolbox is my prescription pad, or doing cognitive behavioral therapy, but I never get around to asking the questions that get at meaning making and find ways to provide spiritual support, I will fail miserably in actually helping this patient get better. And then look to chaplains as a potential team pastor, but I already talked about that, so I'll move on. If your team doesn't have a trained chaplain, there are some things you can do. One of them, of course, is to look for the most qualified person on the team and clear the decks for that person to begin assuming some of those responsibilities. That very well might be a nurse or a social worker or marriage and family therapist or licensed professional counselor. But I guarantee you they cannot do all of the work they are expected to do normally and do this too. So we have got to make allowances if that's going to be the case. Make sure that the relationships are being built with community clergy. I found back in the days, and I spent about 5 years back a long time ago providing pastoral care to a hospice in our community. And one of the things I discovered was that I did not have the time to meet every need, and I didn't have the expertise. I already told you about my faux pas with my Catholic patient. You could put what I know about really providing pastoral care to patients, especially back then, in a thimble. But what I did discover was that there were people who were really good at it. And my job became sometimes to resource them, to help them, to come alongside them, and to help them do what they did better, often to provide a part that was not in their own training. I've met many pastors over the years who spent 3 hours in a seminar like this and came up to me at the end and say, you know, I learned more about grief today because I spent more time today thinking about grief than in all of my years of seminary combined, because we just never talked about it. I've had marriage and family therapists tell me the same thing, and masters trained social workers say the same thing. We spent an hour, we had a lecture here and there, but we've never gotten any great help. So a lot of times that becomes our job, is to resource community clergy, but to help them learn to do their job better. I criticize pastors who make pronouncements like the ones I've quoted today, but if I'm not doing something to help them learn how to do it better, then I am just a noisy gong. And then develop a volunteer pastoral care program. You know, one of the important things we can do if we don't have lots of resources is to recruit people who do, who have both the time and the passion and the compassion to come alongside. Now, don't do that if you don't have somebody to train them, resource them, and support them. But if you've got that person, then make it possible for that person to supervise a cadre of volunteers. At the teaching hospital where I did my initial training, we had this amazing group of volunteer pastoral care people, and they were able to see patients and spend time with patients in many, many ways that the paid pastoral care staff simply didn't have the time to do. We were a 1,000-bed acute care healthcare facility who had 250 trauma patients at any given time. And we had 3 chaplains to do it all. And that's just not enough resources. So what we found was that the staff chaplains concentrated on the tough cases, the critical care, the emergency department, and the trauma unit, and the volunteers did a lot of the regular day-to-day visitation up on the med-surg unit. They saw oncology patients, and some of those that were perhaps a little less predictable and had a little less trauma blended into them. And so, okay. Well, here's my last strategy, is to make self-care a non-negotiable priority, both for yourself and for your team. I'd like you to look at the next slide. Let's see. What's your busy schedule? What fits your busy schedule better? Exercising 1 hour a day, or next slide. Up, it went away. They thought it was a duplicate. That's what I hate about PowerPoint. What it should say is exercising 1 hour a day or being dead 24 hours a day. That's what it should have said. Physical well-being is extraordinarily important. That includes the way we rest, what we eat, how we exercise. Grieving people struggle with nutrition, but I've discovered when we who are their caregivers are under a lot of stress, we do too. We tend to drive through the drive-through between patients. We tend to eat food that is high in fat, high in sugar, therefore high in calories. I don't know if it was this group or last night. If I said it, just smile. But one of my physician colleagues told me early on, you know, I've got the COVID-19. Was that you? I told that this morning? All right. And she meant the pounds she had put on. And that's true for a lot of us. And physical well-being. Make sure that our own personal spiritual focus is intact. I'm a person of faith, and it is a deep faith. My walk with God is extraordinarily important. I try to spend time in the Scripture and in prayer daily. Don't always do it, but I try. I love to listen to Christian worship music, the kind of music you might have noticed was playing in here when you came in this morning and during the break. That feeds my soul. That may or may not feed your soul. But find something, by golly, that does. Find it and make sure that you are doing it and that you are doing it regularly, that you are making your own personal spiritual focus a priority, because we cannot give what we do not have. Then thirdly, make sure that you are taking time for mindfulness and relaxation. Now, mindfulness has gotten a bad name in some places these days because it implies some kind of Eastern mysticism of emptying your mind. I'm not talking about that. I'm simply saying to sit quietly and to do my best in whatever techniques I use. It might be tapping. It might be listening to music to try to clear my mind of the day's trash, because I guarantee you the more I care for people, the more trash I have. One of the ways that I learned to practice, we weren't calling it mindfulness at the time, but for a time when I was practicing in Los Angeles, I don't know how I got drafted to this, and I certainly don't know why I said yes to it, except I was early in my career and I thought I ought to say yes to everything because it was a career move, or I don't know what I was thinking, but I was asked to be part of the Department of Children and Family Services Child Abuse Death Review Task Force. And it was every bit as horrible as it sounds. We read autopsy reports and viewed photos from every child abuse death in the county of Los Angeles. The things that I saw parents and other people do to children are images that I will probably never have erased from my mind. And because I was a father to toddlers at the time, I learned two very important lessons. Do you know it was 13 years after I did that work, and my wife was sitting in a seminar and heard me say what I just said, and I happened to glance over and she was sitting slack-jawed. She never knew that I held that role for 4 years, because I knew in the depths of my soul that I could never bring those stories home. And I found a telephone pole about a half a mile from my house. And in my mind, as I drove into the neighborhood, I packed up the stories and the photos that I had seen that day into a bag, and I hung them mentally on that telephone pole as I passed it, knowing that if I needed them, they would be waiting for me there tomorrow morning when I go back to the office. I will tell you that most mornings I forgot to pick that bag up. But the fact that I had a mental way to deposit that and not bring that any more than it just automatically does into my parenting. You know, I do suspect I'm a different father and grandfather because of that experience. I suspect that I was more patient with my children because I had seen what happens when parents lose their temper and all of that. But the truth is that we all have to find those kinds of strategies that work. That's mindfulness, the relaxation, the finding a place that is apart. It's not in your office. It's not where you see patients. It's somewhere else. It may be out in the woods. It may be at the lakeside. It may be anywhere where that is for you a sacred place that you can relax. It may also be that you do some kind of physical activity there. So you take a walk to clear your head or whatever the case may be. Making sure that we are attending to our emotional health and well-being. Am I keeping short accounts? Am I talking with my friends? Am I telling them how very much they mean to me? Am I making sure that I express gratitude to someone every single day? It can be the cashier at Target. It can be the person whose office is next to mine. It can be the postman or the UPS driver who I just leave a little care package out because goodness knows he's going to be delivering an Amazon package to my door at least 5 days this week anyway. That I say with a little note, I'm sorry I don't know your name because we've never met, but I know your work. And whether it's my shoes or my book or whatever it is, I am so grateful that you do the hard work that you do in the Texas heat and the Texas cold so that I don't have to traipse down to Barnes & Noble, which for me is a fate worse than death. That's what I mean, expressing gratitude. And then social support. Who are the people I'm connected to? I think we all need 3. I don't think you have to have a whole cadre of people. My daughter is proud of having 793 friends on Facebook. I'm pretty sure that 790 of them don't even know who she is. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about are these 3. Every one of us needs a mentor. We need somebody that is ahead of us in whatever this is. We need somebody that's walked a step further, that's been a little longer at it. That's one of the things I love about working with the McAfees. They look to me as a mentor. I am a mentor to their staff, to their team, to Brenda, to Jay, to John, to Tommy. They ask my advice. My advice is usually worth less than they pay for it, but nonetheless, I'm a mentor. And I have mentors. Mine still is J. William Worden. Some of you know Bill Worden's work. You've read his Tasks of Mourning. You've maybe were trained with his textbook on grief counseling. I did my supervised counseling under Dr. Worden, and he is a dear, dear colleague and friend, but he is still a mentor. And every now and then, I will call him up and say, Bill, I'm struggling with this case. Can you help me here? What do you think? At the age of 88, I'm proud to say that once in a while he'll call me and say, Bill, I'm struggling with this case. What do you think? That's one of the things that often happens as mentors become colleagues who become friends. But we all need somebody that's ahead of us. We also need somebody who is behind us. Every one of us ought to be building into the life of somebody who's coming along behind us. It might be a child, it might be a student, it might just be a younger therapist or a younger colleague that just hadn't lived as long or worked as long. Now, I have a whole bunch of those. I have 96 freshmen this semester. Don't ask me how that's going. I fortunately have 6 of the most amazing teaching assistants that any professor could ever hope for, and it's the only way that I would handle 96 freshmen is if I had 6 amazing seniors who really do the heavy lifting. But that's exactly what I mean. We all need people. Last Sunday night, in the midst of Debbie's and my grief, we had scheduled for my TAs to come over and have dinner with us, and I said, there's no way I'm changing that. And they sat with us and they cried with us, and we talked together about the class and about the struggles students are having, and we just enjoyed the fellowship of professor and TAs. And they are students of mine, and I am their mentor, and they are mentors to a whole bunch of freshmen who they are walking alongside and frankly helping in a whole lot of ways that I probably am not even young enough to help with anymore. We all need students. We need somebody coming behind us. But we also all need a third person, and that's a colleague. We need somebody who we can lock arms with and walk arm in arm, who gets it, who laughs at the same stupid jokes, who understands the same sense of history, who, when I say John F. Kennedy, does not think I'm talking about the Soviet president. All right, we need somebody who understands our history, who understands the work we do, who understands the people we read, who follows the same kinds of things that we know about, who can tell patient stories with the best of them, because as bad as mine was today, she's got one who was worse. And all of us need somebody like that. And I don't think any of us need 12 of any of those, and goodness knows you don't need 96. But we all need somebody in each of those categories, and it's really good if we can be something like that to everyone. Well, strategies for walking through this experience, helping people find their way in grief. It is a high, high calling. It is one that all of us have a really big or a really little or something in between role in doing. And it is an incredible opportunity to share the giftedness and the passion that defines our own calling. Thank you. Brenda?
Thank you, Bill. We appreciate it greatly.
And if you want to take Q&A, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah. Anybody have any questions of Bill or any of us?
But I don't know where she is. Does somebody have a mic?
About your books.
She's
They
coming
want
with
to
a
know
mic.
where they
Here
can
she
get-
comes.
Yeah. They want to know about your books. Where can they get your books?
Where can they get the books? Amazon is the cheapest place. Do Funerals Matter is the book that's, there are only two still in print. Do Funerals Matter has been out since 2013. It is just Rutledge. I guess they sold enough copies, they just re-released it as what they call a classic edition. I think that's what their old fogey authors have written now. And so Bob Niemeyer has one, I think it's about 9 or 10 in that collection. So I would look for the classic edition, but the only difference between that and the first one is it has a new preface in it with some things about the pandemic. That book will be updated. I've signed a contract with Rutledge for a second edition. It'll be out in 2024, I think, maybe late 2023. And we'll talk about funerals in the pandemic and some other issues like that. My research on African American funerals will be much more included in that. The other book is called Bereavement Groups and the Role of Social Support. And that book is also available on Amazon, also Rutledge, they're my publisher. And it talks a lot about kind of how, a lot of what we talked about today, the process of grief as we understand it now. And included in that is sort of my outline for how I do groups, which is very simple and straightforward. And I could send it to you in an email if you don't want to spend $40 on the book. Both of those books, there are dozens and dozens of used copies out because a lot of classrooms use them, and then students, who are too stupid to know they ought to keep these books actually sell them back for a quarter of the price. And so you can often pick them up online for $10 or $15, and the 33 cents that I make if you buy a new copy is not worth you paying the big price for the new copy. Go ahead and buy the cheapest thing you can find, okay? So those are the two that I have. There are lots of wonderful things. Those of you who are clergy, If you're looking for a really fine funeral book, the very best one is not mine. The very best one was written by a guy who's now retired from up at Candler, or down at Candler, I guess from here, Tom Long. He did a book called Accompany Them with Singing. Amazing book about Christian funerals. So anyway, yeah. All right. Was there a question over there somewhere? I don't know. Oh, there is. Okay.
First is a statement. Thank you for your transparency about yourself and your family. And my question has to do with what's next for you in your career. What are you going to be doing? You've done so many things, and you're so young. So what are you going to do next?
Yeah, I turn 60 next Thursday, so I am very young by some of your standards and ancient by my student standards. I realize I now have, for the second year, I have students who were born after 9/11. That's a sobering thought. I now have students of parents who actually were in college when I first started teaching. Not at Baylor, but at a community college in California I taught while I was in practice. So what's next for me? Well, I am announcing my retirement at Baylor effective May of 2024. Baylor, all universities love to have a long-term plan to hire replacements or decide they're not going to. And so they sort of give you a sweetheart deal to sign a last 2-year contract. I'll sign that in December to be finished in May of 2024. I probably will do a little more of this. I may see patients a little more frequently. There is both a funeral home and a hospice in Waco, both of whom have asked if I would come run a continuing care or bereavement follow-up program, much like some of the bereavement coordinators in the room do, or like Brenda does at Thomas McAfee. And that could be something like that. I'm looking forward. Debbie and I realized a couple of years ago we really long to see the leaves change in New England, but that doesn't exactly work in a college professor's schedule unless he's on sabbatical in the fall semester, because I can't exactly leave for a week and a half to go to Maine. And so we're looking forward to doing some of those kinds of things. So, yeah. Probably won't write much. I did agree to the revision of the book, but I've written the last book. I don't have the mental acuity to do that anymore, and I know it. It takes me just forever to write now, and the only reason I agreed to that was because it's a revision rather than a new text. I had actually planned to do a book, and after the wreck realized that wasn't going to be in the cards anymore. So I've done the last new book. I feel confident of that, but yeah, probably will volunteer a lot more in our church. I love working with elders, and I'll probably do some things like that.
Any more questions?
And I hope if the young McAfees, if the fifth generation will have me back, when they kick their dads out of the business in a few years, I hope that I'll get to continue coming here until I'm about 83 or so, right? So, all right. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you,
your
Bill.
wonderful,
We appreciate it.
for your wonderful participation today. Thank you,
you.
Brenda.
We have a couple of announcements for you. Those of you who are seeking CEUs, you need to, we want all of you to fill out your evaluation. That's very important to us. We do read those, and we'd like for you to turn those in at the desk and also pick up your CEU certificate as you're leaving, okay? Make sure you do that. We also, we had started a program pre-COVID. I think it used to be pre-9/11. Now it's pre-COVID. It's called Unmasking the Mysteries. And what that program is, we take you through the cremation process and what happens there. You actually get to see the cremation center and go through that, and especially how we at Thomas McAfee do, and people receiving their remains and all those things. And we had great success, and we just started and then we had to stop it. But we want to start that back real soon. So The other thing I want to say to you is in healthcare, you know, we move around a lot, and I had a great email list, but some of you have left and gone to other places, and I don't know where you are. And we do a grief, it's called, Bill writes it, Grief Perspectives, that we mail out every month. And so I'd like for you to make sure you put your email on your evaluation sheet so we can get you on our mailing list for that. Great articles, he's up to date and all that, so we really want you to give us your email so I can update our email list. And for Bill, we just wanted to tell him how much we appreciate him being here, especially under these circumstances. And so, Bill, our blessing to you is that God, who walked on that Emmaus road with grievers, will bend low to you in these grief-filled days. And may your path frequently lead you to the oasis that's called courage. May your eyesight rest on closer horizons colored with hope. May you never lose hope in God's incredible mercy, new every morning and sufficient for the demands of any day. And that's our blessing for any griever as you leave today. Thank you so much, and stay tuned. We'll be back next year. Thank you.